Oh, hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's forum on how to know your Commonwealth offices. And it's sponsored by our Amherst and our Northampton area leagues jointly. It's recorded here, as you have seen, for later viewing on our league websites. And with great thanks to our longtime cable access partner, Amherst Media, we are live on local channel 17 and being live streamed right now on their YouTube channel. I'm Adrienne Terizzi, facilitating this hour on behalf of our leagues as we explore 5 statewide positions on the November 8th ballot. And who doesn't know the time is ticking, and we've 19 days till the midterms. With hats off to the Massachusetts State Legislature for passing the Votes Act of 2022, these COVID-era election reforms, including expanded early voting, online, mail-in, and in-person options, have all been made permanent for primary and general elections. Now, we're going to have a slide with the very important dates and deadlines. And with that slide, and you don't have to write these down because they will be in the chat at some point in time. So early voting begins this Saturday for a 2-week period, October 22nd, as you see, extended till November 4th. October 29th is an important last day to register deadline. November 1st is our deadline, applying for mail-in and absentee ballots. And on November 8th, election day, be at the polls between 7 and 8 p.m. So thank you for that slide, Kathy. But I'd like to say to anyone who might not be familiar with the League or our informational forums, our core value is our nonpartisan statement. We do not support or oppose any political party or candidate. However, we are a political organization, and with the exception of specific league leadership positions, individual members are encouraged to be active. Our founding core mission is our voting rights, voter information and education, and advocacy on our accepted public policy positions, as we did advocate for the Votes 2022 Act. And in fact, this year, our state and local leagues advocated on more than 100 pieces of legislation in our defined policy areas. But tonight, we get to tackle the roles and responsibilities of 5 Commonwealth offices. And Kathy, our Zoom host, is going to put that slide up for you. The positions which will be discussed tonight are going to be presented in order that you see on the slide. Each will be followed in turn by your questions. We'll begin with the Governor's Council, followed by your questions, and move through the list as you see. So what are we not covering tonight? We're not covering the governor's or the lieutenant governor's positions, but perhaps we'll have time at the end for those questions. We're also not covering the 4 referenda questions on the November state ballot, but we refer you to the Secretary of State Red Book and the sources that will come up on the next slide. The slide that you see provides links to the state ballot. This slide refers you to the State League ballot question forums already conducted through other local chapters. Reference to our Amherst League's October newsletter and the State League's position on all of the ballot questions. Now, before I introduce Senator Stan Rosenberg, so we are ready to introduce our discussion leader tonight. I think there's none better. Stan Rosenberg is someone well known to us and certainly well versed on how state government works. Respected policy wonk in the state legislature, where he represented Amherst area for 27 years, chairing several election law committees and rising up through the ranks to hold several leadership posts including Majority Leader, Secretary Pro Tem, and 3 years as State Senate President. Stan is a proud graduate of UMass, a longtime Amherst resident, league member, and friend. I also hear he's a terrific cook. So welcome, Stan. We are so pleased to have you join us again tonight.
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be with my fellow league members and others from the public who may have joined because they're curious about what each of these constitutional offices do as they consider who they're going to vote for. And as Adrian said, we're not going to touch on the governor, lieutenant governor. Hard to imagine there's anybody who doesn't really have a fix on who on these two positions and what they do, and on the candidates for governor, as we're only a few weeks away from election. So we're going to do the offices that are a little further down on the ballot that people don't necessarily all know. Some of you may be new to the state. Some of you may be a long time here in the state, but have just never paid attention to some of these offices. So I hope I can give you a little bit of information that'll help you understand these offices. So we're going to start with the Governor's Council, which is an antiquated body. In colonial days, the king appointed the governor, and in all but one colony, Massachusetts, all of the other colonies, the governor appointed the Governor's Council, and the Governor's Council was the closest thing to what we would think of now as a legislative body. But they were in the tank, as we used to say in Boston, because they were picked by the president. They were picked by the governor. Excuse me. They were picked by the crown on the recommendations of the governor. Well, Massachusetts being Massachusetts, we were the first to start actually electing our governor's council, and the governor's council was the only elected body. And then we had the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives was locally elected people. And then eventually Massachusetts decided to become a bicameral legislative state. And so they started to elect a Senate. And the Senate actually had the real power from the people because they were elected by the people. And so the Governor's Council became less and less and less and less and less important over the years. And in fact, there's only two of the original colonies that still have a governor's council, Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And what does the governor's council do? They take the recommendations of the governor for people that the governor would like to appoint to be a judge. They hold public hearings, they rake them over the coals, and then they debate, and then they decide whether they're going to agree with the governor's recommendation and therefore approve their nomination to the bench. And then if they do, the governor then swears them in and they're a member of the judiciary. And most of the people that the governor recommends do end up being appointed. And depending on the period of time that you're in, the governor's council may be more or less finicky and sticky about the process and how much they grill the candidates and how much they agree or disagree with the governor. But the bottom line is the 8 governor's counselors basically meet every Wednesday at the State House. They are presided over by the lieutenant governor in the absence of the governor, because the governor never goes to the governor's council meetings, and they decide upon judges. They also have the ability to endorse and approve gubernatorial recommendations for things like notary public and clerks of this kind of court or that kind of court who are not elected directly by the people. Some clerks are elected directly by the people, but the clerks of other courts are actually approved by the governor's council based on nomination from the governor. And the final power that I'll reference for now is the last remaining real power of the governor's council, which is every week they must approve the warrant of the Commonwealth, which basically means, okay, you can pay the bills you put in front of us.
Mhm.
And of course, if they want to make a lot of mischief and you're a governor's counselor, you could try to protest item by item or even the whole warrant and cause quite a ruckus. That said, I don't ever remember in all of the years that I've been following politics anyone using that power. And by the way, in the olden days, and by olden days, I mean even in the 50s and 60s here in Massachusetts, the governor's council actually had the power to approve or disapprove the governor's recommendations for candidates that he wanted to name to his cabinet. But that power went away a long time ago, and the governor doesn't have to speak to anybody but himself in making, or herself, soon to be herself, in making those nominations and those appointments. So that's the governor's council in a nutshell.
Thank you, Stan. With that, we're going to entertain some questions, including perhaps questions to some of the humorous past things that we've learned about what's really a rather powerful council. So I see a hand up, and Jessica, I'd like to recognize you. Can you hear me? I've been slipped a note that says I'm not coming through loud enough.
I can hear you fine, Adrian.
Okay. And
Um,
if you would put down your hand after, because I'll take people in a queue as your hands go up.
Sure.
So please go ahead.
Okay. I was just wondering if we could have some sort of compare and contrast. So you say that Massachusetts and New Hampshire are the only ones that have a governor's council. In other states, what is the model? Are they just the populace is electing the judges, or what are some other models that we can compare it to?
Thank you. In many states, judges are elected directly by the people. And a lot of folks say, boy, that's rife for politics. And is that really a good way to choose judges who are going to sit in judgment of people in their community? Well, a significant number of states do that. In other states, like our US Senate, the Senate is the confirming body of judges based on the nominations of the governor.
Mhm. Thank you for your question, Jessica, and your response here, Stan. Any other hands? Well, let me ask a question that came into us, Stan. There are 8 counselors or 8 districts. Can you explain a little bit about that, please?
A councilor district under the current scheme, it's 4 Senate districts combined, and they have to be contiguous. So if you think about Western Massachusetts, we have Berkshire, Franklin, Hampshire, and Hampden counties are all contiguous counties. Those happen to be in one governor's council district. I don't remember the number of the district, but that's the district that we're part of, and it's those 4 counties. And then you go a little further east, and now you've got Worcester. But if you think about Worcester, Worcester County's probably got 3 or maybe close to 4 senators in that county alone because of the size of the population. And so it's the Worcester County plus a little bit of, let's say, Middlesex County and whatever. So the point is, it's 4 Senate districts combined.
Well, thank you for that explanation. I do not see any other hands. So shall we, and if you think of something as we go through the other positions, we can entertain those questions at the end. So Stan, let's move on to the state auditor's position.
State auditor's position is extremely important to us right now because it's probably the most contested and dynamic race among the constitutional officers. Not that there aren't other races that are interesting, but the auditor's race is extremely interesting because of the politics. The governor has endorsed the Republican nominee, and it's the only nominee he has endorsed among the among the constitutional officers, statewide constitutional officers. Okay, so what does the auditor do? Well, the most obvious job of the auditor is auditing the books of the Commonwealth, and the way that's done is by program, agency by agency, on a rotating basis. The auditor sends in an auditing team to review the spending of that agency and see if it comports with what the legislature and governor approved, both in terms of did they overspend their budget or not, and did they spend it on what they were supposed to spend it on. And that's the largest part of the auditor's job. But the auditor has a number of additional duties that were provided to that position over many, many years. And so here are some examples. The auditor is in charge of the Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission, which approves at the state level the ability and right of an individual business to have an alcohol license in a community. The communities give out the licenses, whether it's a package store or a restaurant or whatever. And but the state Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission makes sure that the person is qualified in all aspects. Have they paid their taxes? Do they have any kind of criminal background that might compromise their ability to be an upstanding holder of a license in the community? So those are the kind of examples. And then when you hear about a restaurant or a bar or whatever that's being closed down because of violations of their license, it is the Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission that does the investigations that determine whether or not a person is abiding by their liquor license, and they then can intervene. So it's a shared responsibility between the state and the local government. The auditor is, let me see, did I say that right? Give me a second here. I just realized I might have made a mistake. I think the treasurer is the head of the Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Yes, I'm wrong. The treasurer has the Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission these days. So remember what I said about that later. So let's come back to what the auditor can do. The auditor has a Bureau of Special Investigation, and that was given to the auditor by the legislature to oversee some of the largest programs, Medicaid and other health-related programs, where we get huge amounts of federal dollars, to make sure those dollars are being appropriately spent. And if not, then they are, those entities receive fines and can be prosecuted by the Attorney General's office for various forms of fraud. So it's another oversight and auditing function that they provide. There's a division of local mandates under the Proposition 2.5 law in the 1980s that was adopted here in Massachusetts. It said we can no longer have any laws written by the legislature and approved by the governor which mandate services to be provided by communities without the state paying for them. And it's the job of the state auditor to determine if the legislature has in fact approved and governor signed a new service that is a service established after Proposition 2.5 was made law, in which they require the communities to pay for them because that's no longer allowed. There's also responsibility for providing oversight for borrowing by local cities and towns under certain circumstances. They have to go to the state auditor and get permission to issue bonds under certain circumstances. It's a pretty bureaucratic system that's not worth drilling down on, but suffice it to say that they basically have to come to the auditor, and the auditor will determine whether or not it's a justifiable expenditure using debt service, borrowing money for it. And then the final one that I'll comment on is the so-called Pacheco law that says if you want to privatize a public service, you have to demonstrate that you can save money by privatizing it rather than having it continued to be delivered by public employees. And so a petition gets filed with the auditor, and the auditor makes the decision whether or not it's going to save money. And if it's going to save money, the auditor approves it and it moves forward. If the auditor says it's not going to save money, then it cannot be moved forward. And that's the auditor's office.
Thank you, Stan. Not seeing any hands right now. Oh, Bonnie, I did see your hand go up, and then we'll take Martha's question. Please go ahead, Bonnie.
Thank you for being here, Stan. This is really helpful. My question is two parts. One is, it sounds like this is a pretty technical kind of position. Do they require a certified public accountancy or some kind of qualification? And the second question is, since I saw there's 5 people actually running for state auditor, why would this attract so much attention?
Well, first, the question of, do you have to be a CPA? No, just like you don't have to be an executive to run for governor. You hire people around you who have the additional skills that you do not have to make sure you round out your team. And why would so many people run for this office? Because it's obscure. Most people don't know about it. It pays pretty well. You get a free parking space at the State House. And you end up, it ends up being a career builder for you. You could run for higher office. You can do very well in the private sector after you leave public office. That said, I'm being a little bit jocular about it, but it's a serious responsibility to ensure that our tax dollars are being spent appropriately.
Thank you, Stan. Martha, go ahead, please.
Hello, Stan, and thank you very much for
Sure.
coming tonight. You said that the auditor has to audit then every sort of category, every department, say, of the state spending. Well, how they cycle through them? So how often does each get audited? Once a year, once a month?
No, every now and again. It's years between audits. But my impression is each agency is so large that the larger agencies probably have something being audited every year, so that they're kept on their toes in that large agency. But the reality is there's no fixed schedule, but periodically every agency needs to be audited.
And that's an audit that really does go into detail then.
It goes into detail, and when the auditor issues an audit, it's usually provided to the agency for comment before it's released. They always say, we already fixed the problems. And sometimes they actually have, and other times they're preparing to. And so it's a very, very useful exercise, but there is no way you could have an auditor's office large enough to audit every program in every department of every secretariat every year. It has to be episodic. And but you want to keep every agency on their toes.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Martha, and thank you for that, Stan. Sitting out here in Western Massachusetts, can you give us an example of why we should care about the auditor out here?
Oh, my goodness. Well, because everybody out here is paying taxes, and we want to make sure our dollars are spent well and properly for the purpose for which they were intended. And occasionally, abuses are identified right here in Western Mass that then need to be fixed.
Mhm.
And so it's not just our statewide interest as taxpayers, but it's also to make sure that we have quality people running the agencies in our own region, because so many state agencies and so many programs that are statewide have offices and local versions out here in Western Mass. And we want our service to be efficient and appropriate as much as anybody else.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you for that response to what was a very obvious question about how it impacts us. We're going to go on to the treasurer's, the state treasurer office, Stan. So take it from there.
The state treasurer's office. So the treasurer and receiver general of the Commonwealth basically takes all of the tax monies that are paid and all revenues from all sources, and is responsible to keep the books and make sure we keep track of all the money and make sure that the money's going in the right directions, into the right accounts, into the right agencies, into the right departments. And then the treasurer's office also has some very significant subsidiary kind of responsibilities. So, for example, the state lottery is under the state treasurer, and the state treasurer oversees the that department and makes sure that the policies and programs and operational systems are up to par. I mentioned the Alcoholic Beverage Control Commission, which I was mistakenly attributing to the auditor's office. That is in the treasurer's office. That was actually added a number of years ago, which was why I kind of forgot about that. The treasurer's office also oversees the investment fund for all state pensions. So all state employees are in a state retirement system. That state retirement system is overseen by the state treasurer. The school building authority, which helps fund the building of new schools and renovating of schools throughout the Commonwealth, is under the control of the state treasurer. And then there are some other kind of funky funds. So there's the wastewater treatment fund is under the control of the treasurer. And so the treasurer makes sure that the monies that come in from the federal government and from the state government that are blended in that fund are appropriately distributed to cities and towns based on the applications and the formulas and the requirements. And so it's a very significant duty, because first the treasurer invests those funds to make sure they're secure and making a little money for us, but then make sure that they're distributed fairly and appropriately. So there are a lot of responsibilities that are in the hands of the state treasurer. But first and foremost, the treasurer is responsible to make sure that our books are in order, that money that comes in and goes out is coming into the right accounts and going out from the right accounts to the right places, responsible to make sure that the Commonwealth, that the state government is totally understanding and aware of where we are in relation to the bond market, because we borrow so much money, not only waiting for tax income to come in month by month by month, but also to build roads and bridges and schools and courthouses and college campus buildings and all of those sorts of things. So the treasurer has a very, very serious portfolio that all relates to how the money is managed and how the money comes in and the money goes out.
Hmm.
And the treasurer happens to be unopposed for reelection, if you can believe that.
Yeah.
And so why would there be 5 candidates for the auditor's office, as was pointed out earlier, but only the incumbent running for reelection for a 3rd term? Oh, by the way, the Cannabis Control Commission is under the jurisdiction.
Oh.
Actually, it's not any longer. The treasurer appoints the chair of the Cannabis Control Commission.
So let's see if we have time for that. One more question. Diane, we'll take your question.
Yes, I'm Diane Amsterdam's husband, and I have a question. And the question has to do with between the auditor and the treasurer and also the other officers. Who is most responsible for determining the budget for Western Massachusetts?
The legislature and the governor. The auditor does not control the budget, nor does the treasurer. The budget is the prerogative. The governor proposes a budget. The legislature considers and disposes of the budget by sending back their version following an exhaustive budget process. The governor then may veto certain items of the budget. He may send certain items, he or she may send certain items back for amendment. And the rest, the governor signs. And at that point, it becomes totally the responsibility of the executive to oversee that, that spending. The auditor makes sure that the governor's agencies spend the money properly. The treasurer makes sure that the money flows to the right agencies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. And just a moment before we move on to the Secretary of State, through our YouTube live streaming, I would just like Emily to know that we're going to get to your question that you posed at the end of the Attorney General's, which is the last discussion by Stan of the night. Okay, so hang in there, Emily, with us, and anyone else that's posted a question on YouTube. So let's go right into the Secretary of State office, Stan.
Secretary of State is the chief elections officer for the Commonwealth, and in all 50 states, the Secretary of State is the chief election officer. And in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a series of other responsibilities are given to the Secretary of State. All corporations must register with the Secretary of State and receive their validation that they are a corporation registered in the Commonwealth, duly empowered to do business in the Commonwealth. And that's whether it's a for-profit or a not-for-profit. The Secretary of State has regulatory responsibility with regard to securities and other financial matters that are not within the direct jurisdiction of, let's say, the banking commissioner or the insurance commissioner. So it shares, the Secretary of State's office shares some significant responsibilities with regard to ensuring that the corporations that are engaged in financial services in the Commonwealth, registered through the Secretary of State's office, are behaving appropriately and consistent with the rules and regulations here in the Commonwealth. So while the regulatory agencies may have rate setting and other forms of oversight for insurance and banking and those sorts of things, the Secretary of State's office has a very important set of functions that not only relates to requiring registration, so everybody knows who's doing business in the Commonwealth, but then has certain amount of reach to be able to point out to the Attorney General, and has even some of his or her own as Secretary of State jurisdiction for holding corporate entities accountable for their behavior in the marketplace. It's a very interesting set of responsibilities. And so I would say those are the major responsibilities for the Secretary of State. But above all, it's running honest, reliable, fair elections in the Commonwealth, working with all of the city and town clerks across the Commonwealth to ensure that voters can register, that voters can vote, that votes are counted fairly and accurately and reported fairly and accurately, and then participating in certifying the election of state level officials. The local clerks certify the election of local officials, but the legislature, the Congress, the US Senate, the constitutional officers, the Secretary of State plays a significant role in certifying that they were duly elected and reports this to the legislature. And then when the legislature counts the votes, theoretically counts the votes. In the old days, they did count the votes. Now it's a kind of a rubber stamp process, just certifying and validating the Secretary of State's work that the election was, the results of the election were fairly reported and an individual for each office was duly elected. So that's pretty much what the Secretary of State does. And yeah, our current Secretary of State's been in place for, I think, 6 terms already, which makes it 24 years.
Thank you for that, Stan. Secretary of State during this year, this midterm year, has become fundamentally one of the most critical of all of the positions, and perhaps of many of the positions nationwide. But let me go to Kathy's question.
I was wondering, does the state of Massachusetts have any audit program to, sample by counties or by precincts and do some auditing?
To the best of my knowledge, we do not at this time. There is a process for requesting a recount, which is a form of auditing. It's not exactly what you mean. I know what you mean by an audit, but it's a form of audit. But we do not right now. There was legislation pending, and I do not believe that any legislation has been approved. I was chair of the Election Laws Committee for a period of time, and we did consider that in a very earlier time, and then again about 10 years ago. But we ended up not going in that direction.
Thank you. Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Kathy. Any other questions for Stan on the Secretary of State, or shall we move on? Seeing none. Stan, would you like to take a second and get a drink of water? How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good.
Okay.
No, when I'm ready, when I'm finished and ready for a true sip, it won't be water.
I know. Okay, so what I would like to do is show this booklet. We fondly refer to it as the Red Book, and it should be in each and every one of our homes. So let's go ahead, Stan, tackle the Attorney General's office.
So the Attorney General's office, that is the office that is the Commonwealth's attorney. And the Attorney General, it doesn't mean that the Attorney General represents each of us with our legal concerns, but it does mean that the Attorney General is responsible for defending the laws and rules and regulations which are approved by the Massachusetts government. And the Attorney General can undertake that using attorneys in his or her office, or by naming special attorneys or prosecutors from the legal community, depending upon the circumstances. So anytime a state agency is sued by an agency, by somebody, the Attorney General's office is approached by that agency to represent them. Anytime a major law or rule is challenged in the courts, it's the responsibility of the Attorney General to represent the Commonwealth's position before the court and carry it as far as she or he can in terms of defending the position that the Commonwealth took, either by virtue of the legislature passing a law and the governor signing it, or it being passed into law over the objections of His Excellency the Governor, soon to be Her Excellency the Governor, under the laws of the Commonwealth. And I know that was a partisan statement. I apologize. This is the league. We're not supposed to take partisan positions. Okay. So let
We'll
me see,
accept
what
your
was it?
statement, Stan. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. And then there was, and then there are some other duties that the Attorney General is given, and I'll give you two examples now. The consumer, I'm sorry, the Attorney General may set up programs that are not necessarily directed by the legislature or the governor, but will fall within the purview. So for example, for many decades now, the Attorney General's office has had a robust consumer protection division, and people can call the Attorney General's office and say, I think I'm being scammed. The Attorney General office can research it, find that somebody is actually scamming people in the Commonwealth, and then take them to court in order to stop them from abusing consumers. There's another division that has been popularly used for decades, where the Attorney General has established many years ago, and Attorney General established, and the following Attorney Generals kept going, and that was an energy office that would review rate cases on behalf of the people of the Commonwealth, so that if utilities were trying to gouge people, they would go before the Department of Public Utilities on behalf of the people to say, this rate increase is unreasonable, it's unfair, it's too much. And very often they've been able to get the Department of Public Utilities to investigate thoroughly enough that they would also come to the agreement and finding that it was exaggerated and therefore was unfair to the consumers. So there are a series of these kinds of programs. And more recently, we've given enforcement powers to the Attorney General's office, both with the cannabis, with the creation of the cannabis industry in Massachusetts and the casinos in Massachusetts, by giving specific jobs to the Attorney General in relation to ensuring the integrity of those operations. And the result of that, and as part of that, the Attorney General gets to either name or participate in the naming of one or more commissioners on those boards to help ensure that we have integrity and honesty in those pursuits on behalf of the people of the Commonwealth. So that's essentially what the Attorney General is all about.
Thank you, Stan. This question is going to be similar to the one that you received on, I believe it was the auditor or the treasurer, but the question comes up frequently, and that is, aren't there advantages, a question, aren't there advantages for the Attorney General to be an experienced lawyer, even though the staff is large, and she or he will surround themselves with expertise in the areas that are demanded in the Attorney General's office?
To the best of my knowledge and recollection, it is rare that a person is elected Attorney General who is not an attorney. And they may have been a practicing attorney in different venues. Some of them may have been a district attorney before they became the Attorney General. Others may have been a practicing defense attorney or whatever. But most of them, most in my lifetime that I can remember, I know them as attorneys. So in the case of attorney generals, absolutely, that's what tends to happen. Auditors, not so much.
Thank you, Stan. I see a hand. Sue, Lowry, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you. I was just wondering, Stan, and this is not a put you on the spot question, but to the best of your recollection, when was the last time that utility rates were reduced after an audit by the Attorney General?
Well, when I served in office, there were many times when the amount of the increase was reduced. I can't say that they were eliminated, but I can say that the size of the increase was reduced. Yeah. And by the way, it's not just the Attorney General's office, because often what happened in my experience, is that the consumer groups like Massberg and Audubon and Environmental League of Massachusetts and others would be interveners along with the Attorney General's office. And so it wasn't just the Attorney General's office, but the Attorney General's office had the technical expertise to contribute to the cause. And I would say that in most of my time when I was involved in rate cases, it was Massberg and the Attorney General's office working hand in glove, because I would talk to both the Attorney General's energy person and the Massberg energy person, and I'd figure out by talking to both of them what the story was and figure out where this was heading. And it was both were very effective.
Thank you.
You're welcome. If there is a pause here for a second, it's been bothering me that I need to correct something that I said incorrectly earlier, all the way back to the Governor's Council, because if you do the math, if there are 8 districts and 4 Senate districts per Governor's Council district, you end up with 32 Senate districts. There are 40. So it's 5 Senate districts constitute 1 Governor's Council district. And the reason my math was wrong is because I was remembering back when I did redistricting, and there were 10 districts, each of which had 4 Senate districts. But there are now only 8 Governor's Council districts, and each have 5 Senate districts.
Well, we'll absolutely give you a pass on that, Stan. You served as the chair in the 2010 as well as the earlier redistricting, and you came and helped us out when we did a league forum on the 2020 redistricting. So
Yeah.
It's an easy error to make, and you are more than excused. We have now noted 5 Senate districts. All right, thank you.
And make a note of this, and make a note that I made 2 mistakes tonight, so that if anybody ever says Stan never makes a mistake, you can correct them and tell them, I saw him make 2 mistakes in 1 hour.
Stan, I'm going to ask a follow-up. We're going to be getting to additional questions, but if I may take a point of personal privilege here. Obviously,
The
there are
lady will
many-
state her point of personal privilege.
Okay. uh, quite obviously, there among these state offices, there's a good deal of collaborative work because of shared state policies and even laws. Can you give us one or two of the most obvious that I may have missed throughout this past 15 minutes or so?
Hmm.
Because I'm sure you've worked with all, if not most.
Well, the state treasurer we didn't discuss the governor's office, but the state treasurer and the governor's office have to work very, very closely together to manage the state finances,
Okay.
because the governor is responsible for spending the money appropriately. The governor has to know constantly where we are in money in the bank, money due us, when the money is likely to come in, and things of that nature. So there would be one very obvious
Mhm,
situation.
mhm. Well, thank you, Stan. We've covered those 5 positions. And what I would like to do to start off any additional questions that people may have thought of is the one that came in on the did I say the YouTube streaming? And it goes back to the Governor's Council, as a matter of fact. Emily Evans, if you're listening, I hope you still are, we're going to ask Stan to respond to your question. She asks, has there been any initiative to have judges elected by the people in Massachusetts instead of using the current legacy process?
So in the 40 years that I've been paying attention, no one has filed legislation that I am aware of to have judges elected. But there has been a constitutional amendment filed virtually every session to eliminate the governor's council. If you eliminate the governor's council, you must replace it with something. But no one has filed legislation to say by what method would we replace the governor's council as relates to the selection of judges. And at that point, if the governor's council were to be eliminated, that would open up the debate as to whether we would follow the path of electing judges versus allowing a legislative body to appoint judges.
Mhm.
And some states, as I said, do elections, and other states have a legislative body. Most of them use the Senate, but some use the House, and some use a joint committee,
Mhm. Mhm.
a joint legislative committee, I should say.
Thank you. Thank you again, Stan. Any further thoughts from our attendees? Well, there've been some terrific questions. I think you give yourself a
Oh.
round of applause. Kathy, did I hear you? Somebody's hand is back up. So before we give yourselves a round of applause, it's Mr. Anderson. Please go ahead. You can unmute yourself if you've got a question.
Can I just step in first since I was before them?
Yes.
Oh, Sue, did I miss your hand?
You did, but I forgive you
That's
always.
a big mistake. I'm so
No,
sorry.
no, no.
Please go right ahead.
I just have a question about the practical implications of the governor's council. When I read about them, I heard they were also responsible for pardons and commutations of sentence.
Yes, thank you.
And I'm curious as to what you've witnessed in terms of the practical implications of that.
Thank you for reminding us that they do have the power to confirm the governor's pardons and commutations. They are rare, but they do happen, and they usually happen toward the end of a governor's term in office. And so they become very, very hot political topic at the time, because many governors, counselors will try to stay in office beyond the term of the governor, but the governor is using his or her exit as the opportunity to right what they consider to be either some injustices or to provide societal forgiveness as having been earned by a particular individual or group of individuals. So it's a very political process.
Thank you.
Sorry about that, Sue. Great question. Yes, the one who's raised his hand, I beg your pardon. I called you Mr. Anderson.
Yeah, I'm Michael Child. So, Stan, thank you for all your service over many years.
Thank you.
Question has to do with appointees of the court system. So I'm a psychologist and I serve as a guardian ad litem for the state of Massachusetts at various times in family and probate court. And the state pay rate for guardian ad litems is $50 an hour. The state pay rate for attorneys who serve as category F guardian and ad litem is $40 an hour. And is there a procedure to have those rates raised? How does one go about that?
Yeah, that requires action by the legislature in coordination with the governor and the court system. And these pay rates for various offices of people who serve in the courts, very vital functions, some of them as public employees, some of them under contract. They're all over the place, and they're mostly inadequate and not fair rates. It really requires the enormous generosity of heart by the people who are doing this work. And I witnessed repeated attempts and was a part of repeated attempts to try to fix some of these rates. And it's extremely difficult to do because these are people who are kind of out of sight, out of mind. So, yeah.
Yeah. Would the place for me to start is with my local representative?
You start with your legislator. And if you have, some of these groups have organizations,
Yes.
and you combine, you create power by joining in force with others, and together identify champions in the legislature and work to try to achieve some parity, some equity, some reasonable compensation. And it works best when you have a large enough coalition and when you have a multi-year plan, so that you can grow incrementally rather than try to close the gap too quickly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you. And we are running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to entertain another question. Stan, do you want to leave us with a final comment? You've got the last word if we can do that, and then we can come to a close for the evening.
Vote early, vote early, and vote often, but only once per election.
Thank you. A round of applause for Stan, and a round of applause for yourselves, attendees. Some terrific questions tonight. And thank you, Stan, for helping us have an hour so well spent. It's been assistive and informative. And on behalf of us all, thank you for your enormous service to not only our region, but to the state during your long tenure. I'm going to have to go very quickly because I've got to get in the following. I want to thank the Forum Planning Committee, Bonnie, Sue, Kathy, the two Sues, Jessica, and Lou, and Amherst Media, and Alexa. A reminder that member dues are due, and if you're not a member, come and join us. Please fill in the short survey that's at the end of this session before you close your window. And I'll just repeat what we can't hear too often, and what Stan just left us with, those important words: vote, and not only vote, take someone to the polls with you. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us tonight, and good night.